NATO's heartbeat pulsed in Turkey's capital Ankara in 2026. The alliance's leaders came together in Turkey again after a full 20-to-year hiatus. The summit's heaviest agenda item was without a doubt the war between Ukraine and Russia. At that meeting, Zelensky was also at the table. Donald Trump's eyes were insistently fixed on a single man, Erdogan, because Turkey's role within the alliance was becoming more critical every day. In that geopolitical corridor stretching from the Black Sea to the eastern Mediterranean, Trump was seeing Turkey with an increasingly clear eye. Perhaps the only NATO member that could stop Russia in the region. Before we go any further, if you're the kind of person who wants to understand what's really happening beneath the surface of international politics, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what I'm about to show you is not what you're seeing on cable news. This is the picture beneath the picture, and it changes everything. On July 7th and 8th, 2020-6, leaders of the 30- to NATO member states gathered in Ankara for the alliance's 30-6 summit. Turkey was hosting for the first time since the 2004 Istanbul summit. The agenda included defense spending, burden sharing, support for Ukraine, and defense industry cooperation. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan called for closer defense cooperation among allies and renewed efforts to advance peace in the Middle East and Ukraine. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said the summit's outcomes would strengthen NATO's capabilities and reinforce allied unity. But while the cameras rolled and the diplomatic statements were issued, something else was happening behind closed doors. Something that would reshape the balance of power in the Black Sea and send a message directly to Moscow. On the second day of the summit, Trump took an unexpected and major step. He decided to lift the sanctions applied to Turkey for years under the CIA-TSA law. And here's what he said. Quote, "I can tell you we're going to be taking the sanctions off. We're going to be taking the sanctions off. It's time to do that. We don't want to sanction friends. It's very simple." This move was not just cracking open the F-35 door for Ankara. It was also making the invisible buffer drawn against Russia in the Black Sea much stronger. So how does a sanctions decision targeting Turkey translate into a buffer against Russia? Since 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, it virtually turned the peninsula into a fortress. With the S-400 air defense systems, Bastion anti-ship missiles, and electronic warfare equipment it placed there, it created an access-denial shield covering nearly all of the Black Sea's errant sea space. This shield is powerful enough to deter conventional warplanes and has been restricting NATO's room to maneuver in the region for years. But the F-35 has a fifth-generation stealth aircraft and has the ability to infiltrate this shield while being nearly invisible to radar. In other words, the F-35 seconds plan to enter Turkey's inventory could theoretically neutralize Russia's air defense in Crimea. They could even directly threaten Russian warships in the Black Sea when needed. The most irritating aspect of this picture for Moscow is that it was once its own creation. Russia, by selling Turkey the S-400 years ago, had made a major diplomatic move. Thanks to the American sanctions that sale triggered, it had effectively blocked the delivery of more than 100 F-35 seconds to Turkey. For the Kremlin, this was a strategic gain achieved on its southern flank. It had deprived NATO's second most powerful army of the alliance's most advanced aircraft. Now, the possibility of Trump reversing that gain with a single move was disrupting the game Putin had set up years ago. Moreover, Trump, while praising Erdogan as a very strong leader in Ankara, was not only cracking open the F-35 door. The truly critical dimension was in fighter jet engines, specifically the American-made F-110 engine, because this engine sits at the heart of both Turkey's existing F-16 fleet and the future of the country's most ambitious defense project, KIN. This fifth-generation national fighter jet Turkey developed on its own was dependent on precisely that American engine for its first serial production blocks to fly. At least for now. The U.S. State Department had already notified Congress of its intention to sell Turkey about 80 General Electric F-110 turbofan engines in a package worth more than $700 million. But Congress had a 15-day window to act, and opponents were mobilizing to block it. So the lifting of sanctions was strengthening Turkey from two directions simultaneously. On one side, the possibility of acquiring a ready-made power like the F-35. On the other, the opportunity to produce its own national aircraft. Of course, there are still obstacles ahead, like congressional approval, and the fate of the S-400 seconds. But the real logic underlying all these steps is rooted in a single question: why did America lift these sanctions now? Because the step Trump took was actually a message sent not to Turkey, but precisely to Russia. To decode this message, you first need to understand what makes Turkey so unique in this equation. What makes Turkey both indispensable and unsettling in Russia's eyes is hidden in an ever-changing geography. At the heart of this geography lies an obsession Russia has chased for centuries, reaching warm, non-freezing seas. The Russian Empire throughout history always wanted to reach open oceans, uninterrupted trade and naval routes. And one of this dream's most critical exit points was the Black Sea. However, the Black Sea is actually a massive enclosed basin. There's only one exit connecting it to the world's open waters, the Istanbul and Canal Straits. And the sole master of these two narrow passages has been Turkey for nearly 3 centuries. In other words, Russia's Black Sea Navy is forced to pass through Turkey's permission, through Turkey's waters, to reach the Mediterranean and from there the world's seas. This is the very truth that makes Putin so cautious toward Turkey. Think about it. A country holds the key to the door of your greatest strategic access to the open seas. For Russia, the Black Sea is not just a sea. It's the exit gate of its power extending south to the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and Africa. But the lock on that gate is in an ATO member's hands. This is a vulnerability that structurally makes Russia dependent on Turkey and defenseless before it. This geographic card Turkey holds has a legal foundation that transforms it into real power. The Montreux Convention on the Straits. This treaty played a much quieter, but much heavier role in the Ukraine war than most people realized. It handed control over the straits completely to Turkey. The sole authority deciding which ship can and cannot pass through these waters is Ankara. But the treaty's true genius is hidden in the fine line separating peace from war. In peacetime, the door is open to everyone. Commercial vessels can pass through the straits freely. When war breaks out, Turkey's hand acquires an entirely different power, the authority to restrict or even completely halt the passage of warships from non-Black Sea littoral states. This clause, though it may look like a technical detail on paper, transformed into a real strategic weapon in 2020-2. When Russia invaded Ukraine, Ankara didn't hesitate to use this authority and closed the straits to warships. There is a critical nuance most people overlook here. Turkey did not take sides in doing this. As required by Montreux, it closed the door to everyone without discrimination. But this seemingly neutral moves result on the ground work directly against Russia. Because the war progressed and Russia's Black Sea fleet melted before Ukraine's drones and missiles. Moscow wanted to reinforce this fleet but couldn't. They wanted to bring warships from the Baltic or the Mediterranean into the Black Sea, but found the door Turkey closed before it. Thus Russia was deprived of the chance to compensate for its losses, and its naval power at the most critical moment was abandoned to its own fate without receiving any support from outside. Because the straits were closed, not just Russia, but no external power could bring warships into the region. This prevented the conflict from spreading across the entire Black Sea basin. Turkey's stance against Russia is not limited to just a defensive move like closing the straits. In recent years, Ankara, by taking much more proactive steps in the Black Sea and beyond, became one of an ATO's toughest and most capable defense players in the region. Moreover, this is not an empty claim. It rests on concrete military capacity. To understand how bold this stance is, looking at the past is sufficient. Turkey, by shooting down a Russian jet that violated its airspace in 2015, did something no other ally dared to do. This was not a one-time display of courage either. Turkey in recent years effectively took opposite sides against Russia on 3 separate continents in different theaters. In Syria, it supported the opposition against the regime Russia protected for years. In Libya, Turkish Bayraktar drones kept the Tripoli government standing against forces backed by Russia's mercenaries and warplanes. In the South Caucasus in the 2020 Karabakh War, Turkish drones again gave Azerbaijan a decisive advantage against Russia's ally Armenia. So wherever Russia reached, it most often found Turkey and Turkish technology before it. This means field experience. No other member within an ATO carries this. Behind this experience is a strong military infrastructure. First, this truth needs to be remembered: Turkey has an ATO's largest army after America. But what's truly striking is the domestic defense industry it built in recent years. Today, Turkey is one of the world's leading armed and manned aerial vehicle producers, so much so that a single Turkish company, DKR, holds approximately 60% of the global combat drone export market. Moreover, this superiority was proven in its most concrete form on the battlefield. Turkey's Bayraktar drones reached Kiev's hands at a time when no Western country was willing to provide lethal weapons to Ukraine in the invasion's first weeks. These drones became one of the strongest symbols of Ukrainian resistance by destroying Russian armored columns and resupply convoys advancing on the capital. But Turkey's support was not limited to drones alone. Ankara also sent Ukraine mine-resistant KRPI armored personnel carriers, laser-guided missiles, heavy machine guns, and protected military equipment. And here's the kicker: BKA, our promise to build a drone factory near Kiev with a $100 million investment. Despite all the war's uncertainty, it didn't abandon this project. This military power's value for an ATO is also becoming increasingly visible. Turkish defense industry is now penetrating not just distant geographies but directly the alliance's heart. For example, Poland became the first ATO and EU country to purchase Turkish Bayraktar drones, and defense cooperation between the two countries has been deepening and continuing since then. Moreover, Turkey is participating in alliance initiatives to develop PAN-AO- compatible unmanned systems and establishing joint production lines with European defense giants. Indeed, one of the most important agenda items at that NATO summit in Ankara was exactly this defense industry cooperation. Turkey's concrete steps in the Black Sea complete this picture. In early 2020-4, Ankara established a joint task force with Romania and Bulgaria to clear sea mines left from the war in the Black Sea. These three countries, all NATO members, both made maritime trade safe and displayed a common will against Russia's naval supremacy. At the Ankara summit, the three defense ministers signed an amendment expanding the group's mission. Command of the group rotates every 6 months, with Turkey currently holding command. Beyond this, Turkey is conducting regular naval patrols in the Black Sea, laying the foundations for a new naval command structure at Istanbul. It is continuously surveilling the region with domestic unmanned aerial vehicles like the Anka. Concrete events proving this vigilance is not in vain also occur. The war's violence in the Black Sea increasingly began threatening Turkish-owned commercial vessels as well. Indeed, in June 2020-6, a Turkish-owned dry cargo vessel was directly targeted in an attack in the Black Sea. Turkey's foreign ministry condemned the incident harshly with an official statement. For Ankara, this is not an abstract war happening far away. It's now a threat directly concerning its own flagships, its own citizens, and its own economic interests. This is precisely why Turkey is tending toward an increasingly clear and determined stance against Russia's expansionism in the Black Sea. However, to correctly read Turkey's Russia policy, one shouldn't view it as a one-dimensional hostility. What Ankara follows is a much more refined and calculated balanced policy that manages both sides. And without understanding this balance, grasping Turkey's real strategy is not possible. On one side of the equation are the pragmatic relations maintained with Russia. Erdogan kept his personal dialogue channel with Putin open throughout the war. Turkey did not join the sanctions the West applied to Moscow, and the two countries continued cooperation in many areas from energy to trade. But this open channel also gave Turkey a unique role, the role of a mediator who can talk to both sides. Indeed, at one of the war's most critical moments in 2020-2, Turkey personally mediated the agreement that resolved the grain shipment blockage threatening the world with a food crisis. On the other side of the equation stands that directly counterbalanced Russian weapons provided to Ukraine, the closing of the straits, and military presence in the Black Sea. The most noteworthy thing in this balance is Turkey's clear stance on Crimea, because Ankara, despite all its economic ties with Russia, has not accepted even for a moment since the 2014 annexation that Crimea belongs to Russia. Erdogan argued repeatedly and openly that the peninsula must be returned to Ukraine. This is not merely a foreign policy principle for Ankara either, because the Crimean Tatars, the original inhabitants of Crimea, are a Turkic people carrying deep historical, cultural, and kinship ties with Turkey. This bond transforms the Crimea issue from a cold geopolitical calculation into an emotional matter as well for Ankara. But beneath Erdogan's stance lies alongside sentimentality and extremely concrete interest calculation as well. Because who holds Crimea directly determines who will control the Black Sea. Crimea under Russia's occupation is a military springboard enabling Moscow to dominate the entire region. From there, it can keep much of the Black Sea under threat. What Turkey wants is the exact opposite of Black Sea, held in balance not by a single power, but by literal states open to trade and navigation. This entire picture makes Turkey appear extremely powerful against Russia. But looking only at this side of the medal would draw an incomplete picture. Because no matter how strong Turkey's hand is, there are also serious constraints breaking it against Russia. At the top of these constraints is in a single word: energy. Turkey sources approximately 40–5% of its natural gas needs from Russia alone. And this dependency is not the kind that can be broken overnight. The country's first nuclear power plant, Akudu, is being entirely built and operated by Russia's state company Rosatom. Moreover, the matter doesn't end with energy. Trade volume between the two countries reached historic peaks in the post-war period, and Turkey became one of Russia's largest trade partners after China. Millions of Russian tourists flock to Turkey every year, and a large number of Russian citizens fleeing the war have settled in Turkey. Turkey, while militarily counterbalancing Russia on one hand, is this deeply intertwined with its economy on the other. This means a serious card Moscow can always use. There is also a memory showing Russia can use this economic card without hesitation. When Turkey shot down that Russian warplane in 2015, Moscow's retaliation was swift and harsh. It imposed an embargo on Turkish agricultural products, instantly cut Russian tourism, and virtually transformed economic pressure into a weapon. That period's tension still reminds that every direct confrontation Turkey has with Russia can carry an economic bill. Add to this the unresolved S-400 issue. Turkey still holds these Russian systems, and until their fate is clarified, it's not possible to say the obstacles on the F-35 path have completely lifted. Still, these constraints are not the end of the story, because in recent years, concrete signs are accumulating that the balance is slowly shifting in Turkey's favor. Ankara moved to reduce its energy dependency on Russia for its second nuclear plant, Sinop. It's now inviting America and South Korea to the table instead of Rosatom, and diversifying liquefied natural gas purchases to different sources. This shifting balance, combined with Trump's move in Ankara, also reveals why the side being truly squeezed is Russia. Now it's time to bring all these pieces together, because the real meaning of Trump's move at Ankara only emerges in the biggest picture, the balance in the Black Sea turning against Russia, and the nightmare scenario this creates for Moscow. First, let's look at this picture. All of Russia's power in the Black Sea leans on a single support-occupied Crimea. Ukraine is inflicting blows on Crimea and Russia's Black Sea assets nearly every day, sinking its tankers, collapsing its air defense, striking its bases. The Black Sea fleet is melting a little more every month and huddled in its ports. In other words, Russia's power in the region is already slowly unraveling. Putin's real nightmare is the possibility of a second pressure being added on top of this picture. For a moment, think about what happens if Russia, while dealing with Ukraine's relentless blows on one hand, faces a much stronger NATO front led by Turkey on the other. When these two pressures stack on top of each other simultaneously, Russia finds itself inside a complete vice. It can either compensate for its losses at sea or maintain its Black Sea dominance. This deadlock in the Black Sea directly affects the fate of the entire Ukraine war, because the logistics feeding Russia's southern front is also tied to that shaken base in Crimea. As Russia squeezed in Crimea and the Black Sea begins losing initiative advantage in the war as a whole, this picture also has a diplomatic face that makes Turkey's role even more interesting. Because Ankara, while building all this military balance, simultaneously stands at the very center of the effort to end the war. Turkey, as one of the rare countries that can talk to both sides, since 2020 to brought the warring parties to the negotiation table multiple times. Talks held in Istanbul, while not bringing a permanent ceasefire, enabled the mutual release of thousands of prisoners. Even before this NATO summit in Ankara, Erdogan openly announced he was taking action to bring the parties back to the table and revive the diplomatic process. This dual position is precisely what makes Turkey such a key actor. Trump's move in Ankara sits precisely on top of this picture, strengthening Turkey with F-35 seconds, fighter jet engines, and full ally status actually means raising the barrier before Russia even higher, tightening that vice even more. Trump chose to consciously strengthen the hand of the country Russia fears most in the region at perhaps the very moment Putin is most vulnerable. The Ankara summit concluded on July 8th with several decisions expected to shape the alliance's next phase of development commitments to increase defense investment, boost military-industrial capabilities, expand support for Ukraine, and Europe assuming greater responsibility within the common security structure. The Ankara Summit Declaration reaffirmed that allies remain committed to Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, the transatlantic bond, at a 3-100- approach to deterrence and defense. But beneath the diplomatic language, something real shifted. Turkey secured a pledge for the lifting of CAATSA sanctions, for the acquisition of F-35 fighter jets, and for engines for Turkey's locally made Ki and jet. The question now is, will Congress approve? Will the S-400 seconds be returned or stored? And how will Russia respond? Because one thing is certain. The balance in the Black Sea is shifting, and the country holding the lock on the straits just got a lot stronger. So which direction will Turkey, holding the Black Sea's lock, pull the balance in this new era? Share your thoughts in the comments. We will continue to follow these developments. Subscribe to the Geo Network. Thank you for watching. If you made it this far, you're the kind of viewer who wants the real picture, not the headlines, but what's actually happening beneath them. Hit that like button, drop a comment with your take on what happens next, But if you haven't already, subscribe, because this story is far from over, and when the next wave hits, you'll want to be here to understand what it actually means. I'll see you in the next one.